So, this week, with 19 days left before Jamieson Greer must formally notify Congress of the United States government's intentions toward CUSMA, the Trilateral Trade Agreement covering $1.9 trillion in annual commerce and 30% of global GDP, the specific legal architecture that Donald Trump has been trying to escape, has become visible in its complete form for the first time. And what it reveals is that the man who called CUSMA irrelevant, who said we can have it or not, who floated the idea of abandoning the only trade framework in American history with a mandatory joint review mechanism in favor of bilateral deals that would give him unilateral control of each relationship, has walked directly into the most elegantly constructed legal trap in the history of a trade agreement that he personally negotiated, personally signed, and personally praised before deciding 6 years later that it was irrelevant. The trap is Article 34.7 of CUSMA, the review and term extension provision, the sunset clause, the mechanism that Trump's own first-term trade team built into the agreement specifically, as then USTR Robert Lighthizer told Congress at the time, to allow for periodic review and adjustment rather than eternal commitment. The provision that Trump praised as proof that he had negotiated a better deal than NAFTA. The provision that is now the reason he cannot shred the trilateral treaty, cannot replace it with bilateral deals of his own design, cannot unilaterally remove the tariff protections that shield Canada and Mexico's exports to American markets, and cannot execute the bilateral strategy that Greer has been pitching to think tanks, to Congress, and to allied capitals for 6 months without triggering a cascade of legal, political, and institutional consequences that his own administration has not yet publicly acknowledged it is prepared to absorb. Carney has been watching the legal architecture close around the bilateral play for months. He has been saying it quietly, through trade lawyers and institutional framing rather than public confrontation, in the language of a central banker who understands that the most powerful thing you can do with a contractual obligation is let it speak for itself. Article 34.7 is speaking for itself. And what it is saying is this: the United States cannot shred the trilateral, it can only exit it. An exit takes 10 years. And Canada and Mexico keep their protections while the exit clock runs. Warren Buffett said the most dangerous trap in any negotiation is the one built by the person sitting on your side of the table. The man who built the sunset clause into CUSMA to give himself leverage over NAFTA's permanence has just discovered that the sunset clause applies to every party equally, including the one who insisted on putting it in. Hit subscribe because Greer's June 1st congressional notification is 19 days away, the formal CUSMA review begins in 49 days, and the legal options available to Washington for replacing the trilateral with bilateral deals are significantly more constrained than 6 months of think tank speeches and congressional testimony have implied. Let me take you through the exact legal architecture of Article 34.7 and why it has stopped Trump's bilateral play cold. The trilateral strategy that Trump and Greer have been floating since December 2025 is simple in its political logic and complicated in its legal execution. The political logic is this: Canada and Mexico have different relationships with the United States. Canada is a developed democracy with a rule of law tradition, a service-oriented economy, an advanced manufacturing sector, and a resource endowment that makes it the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, uranium, oil, and critical minerals to the American market. Mexico is a developing economy with a large manufacturing sector, significant labor cost advantages, a complex relationship with organized crime and rule of law institutions, and a border through which both goods and people move in volumes that the American political conversation treats as categorically different from the northern border. The argument for separate bilateral deals is that these two relationships are different enough that a single framework governing both misses the specific leverage Washington can apply to each. You can negotiate harder with Canada on dairy and digital laws when Mexico is not in the room. You can negotiate harder with Mexico on rules of origin and manufacturing content requirements when Canada is not in the room. Divide and manage. Greer said it explicitly at the Atlantic Council in December 2025. Our economic relationship with Canada is very, very different than our economic relationship with Mexico. The labor situation is different. The import-export profile is different. The rule of law is different. So it makes sense to talk about things separately with Canada and Mexico. He confirmed it was operational rather than theoretical. I have not had a meeting this year where I sat with Canada and Mexico in a room, and we sat together and talked about USMCA. The bilateral approach was not a hypothetical. It was already the operational format of American trade engagement with its two CUSMA partners. The legal problem with the bilateral approach is what the political framing has been consistently avoiding, and what Article 34.7 forces into the open. CUSMA is not merely a diplomatic arrangement. It is domestic American law. The CUSMA Implementation Act, Public Law 116-113, was signed into law by Trump himself on January 29, 2020. It approved and implemented the trade agreement through the American constitutional process that requires congressional action for trade agreements of this magnitude. The Implementation Act is what makes the CUSMA tariff exemptions real in the American legal system. It is what requires United States Customs and Border Protection to grant duty-free treatment to goods that meet CUSMA rules of origin. John Boscariol, a trade lawyer and partner at McCarthy Trilateral, who has spent his career at the intersection of Canadian and American trade law, identified the consequence with a precision that every trade official on both sides of the border has been sitting with since he said it publicly in February 2026. Right now, the customs laws in the United States provide that Canadian product that meets the rules of origin under the CUSMA can enter the United States duty-free. Those are domestic laws that would have to change if the United States were to withdraw. Domestic laws, not a presidential proclamation, not an executive order. Domestic laws of the United States Congress that require congressional action to change, that were passed with bipartisan support, that the CUSMA Implementation Act codified into the American legal system in a form that no president can unilaterally override. This is the first wall that Article 34.7 builds around the bilateral play. The tariff exemptions that make CUSMA valuable to Canada and Mexico are American law. Removing them requires Congress. And Congress, in May 2026, is a body whose bipartisan coalition of senators is writing letters to Greer urging CUSMA renewal, citing $176 billion in American agricultural exports, whose primary markets are Canada and Mexico, warning that the bilateral dismemberment of the agreement would be an economic catastrophe for American farmers, American manufacturers, and American workers whose jobs depend on the integrated North American supply chain that CUSMA governs. Article 34.7 itself is the specific provision that the congressional analysis, the Bank of Canada analysis, and the trade lawyers who specialize in CUSMA institutional architecture have all identified as the mechanism that constrains Washington's options more severely than Trump's public statements have acknowledged. The provision is officially titled Review and Term Extension. It establishes that the three parties committed to begin the first joint review on July 1st, 2026, the 6th anniversary of CUSMA's entry into force. At that review, each party must make one of three choices. First, confirm extension of the agreement for another 16 years to 2042. Second, signal non-renewal and non-withdrawal simultaneously, which keeps the agreement in force and triggers annual reviews for up to a decade until the agreement's original termination date of July 1st, 2036. Third, withdraw from the agreement entirely, which under Article 34.6 requires 6 months written notice and triggers a process that takes at least 6 months to complete, during which the agreement remains in full force. The trap that Carney's legal team identified and that has been operating silently in the background of every public confrontation is the interaction of these three options with Trump's stated goals. Trump wants to replace the trilateral with bilateral deals. But no matter which of the three options Washington chooses at the July 1st review, the bilateral deals it wants cannot be put in place through the CUSMA framework. They would have to be separate agreements, negotiated from scratch, ratified through whatever domestic process applies to each, and implemented through domestic law changes. And while those new bilateral agreements are being negotiated, drafted, ratified, and implemented, the old multilateral agreement, CUSMA, remains in force. Article 34.7 is not a date on which the agreement ends. It is a date on which the agreement's future is reviewed. And the agreement's default position, under all scenarios except full formal withdrawal, is continuation. International trade lawyer Alexander Hobbs at the firm Cassidy Levy Kent stated the legal reality so plainly that it should have ended the bilateral narrative when he said it in February 2026. Unless the United States withdraws, the CUSMA agreement will stay in force for another 10 years. We are not at risk of the agreement expiring in July. That is not how this works. That sentence, unless the United States withdraws, the CUSMA agreement will stay in force for another 10 years, is the Clause 34 trap's full expression. Trump can call CUSMA irrelevant. Greer can float bilateral deals at think tanks. The administration can send entry fee demands to Canada, conduct bilateral talks with Mexico separately, ice Canada out of the formal negotiating process, and fail to schedule a single formal bilateral negotiating session between the American and Canadian trade ministers. And CUSMA will still be in force. The tariff exemptions protecting 85 to 90% of Canadian exports to the American market will still be in force. The rules of origin that govern what counts as CUSMA compliant will still be in force. The dispute resolution mechanisms that Canada can use to challenge American tariff actions will still be in force. The legal infrastructure of the continental trade relationship that the bilateral play was supposed to replace will still be in force, unless the United States undertakes the full formal withdrawal process that requires 6 months' notice, domestic congressional legislation to change the Implementation Act's tariff provisions, and a decade of negotiating consequences that every American agricultural exporter, every American automotive manufacturer, and every American steel consumer has warned Congress it is not prepared to absorb. The bilateral play is not blocked by Canada. It is not blocked by Mexico. It is blocked by the legal text of Article 34.7 of an agreement that Trump negotiated, signed, praised, and then decided was irrelevant, and whose irrelevance he cannot actually implement without Congress. Carney has been navigating the Clause 34 architecture with the quiet precision of a person who understands the legal text better than the person who is threatening to exit it. He said it directly on April 22nd when asked about the entry fee demands and the bilateral pressure. It is not a case of the United States dictates the terms. We have a negotiation. We can come to a mutually successful outcome. It will take some time. Those 4 words, it will take some time, are not a diplomatic stall. They are a description of the legal reality. Article 34.7 gives Canada time. The annual review mechanism that activates if the United States signals non-renewal without withdrawal keeps the agreement in force while the negotiations continue. The 10-year window from 2026 to 2036 is not a period of CUSMA dissolution. It is a period of CUSMA continuation under annual review. During that decade, Canada's exports retain their CUSMA exemptions. During that decade, Canada can continue to build its alternative trade architecture. During that decade, Canada can complete the internal trade market, the critical minerals strategy, the Arctic infrastructure commitment, the Nordic Security Partnership, and the 12 deals on 4 continents that Carney told Trump about on the phone in January. The time that Carney says it will take is not dead time. It is the time Article 34.7 allocates for sovereign nations to make their best cases and arrive at outcomes that reflect actual negotiation rather than unilateral imposition. The Mexico dimension of the Clause 34 trap is the element that the bilateral strategy's architects appear to have underestimated most severely. The bilateral approach only works if Mexico and Canada can be separated, if each can be managed independently, if the divide and manage dynamic that Greer described so explicitly at the Atlantic Council operates without the 2 smaller partners coordinating. The 1,800 business meetings that happened in Toronto and Montreal during the May 7th and 8th Mexico-Canada trade mission, confirmed by CBC News published 36 hours ago, is the visible evidence that the coordination is not only happening but institutionalizing. Canada-United States Trade Minister LeBlanc said on March 30th, after both countries had been subjected to months of bilateral pressure from Washington, that the Mexicans are also committed to a trilateral deal. Not a bilateral, a trilateral. The Canadian minister responsible for CUSMA negotiations was telling the world that the other partner Washington had been managing separately, the partner whose bilateral talks with the United States Greer had described as more advanced, the partner whose leadership Greer's deputy Switzer called grown-ups in contrast to what he characterized as Carney's approach, was committed to the same trilateral outcome that Canada insists on. Mexico has economic reasons for this position that are entirely independent of its relationship with Canada and that the bilateral strategy's logic cannot overcome. The $1.9 trillion in trilateral trade that CUSMA governs creates supply chains that flow in 3 directions, not 2. Mexico's manufacturing sector depends on Canadian and American inputs. Canadian mining and agriculture depend on American and Mexican markets. American manufacturing depends on Canadian and Mexican components and labor. A bilateral deal between the United States and Mexico that excludes Canada does not create a simplified bilateral supply chain. It creates a trilateral supply chain without a legal framework for one of its 3 legs. Policy Magazine's analysis of the CUSMA outlook noted that Greer himself acknowledged that rules of origin for automobiles fit best in a 3-way deal with Canada and Mexico, and that critical minerals and alignment of external trade policies could also be part of a trilateral agreement. The very issues Washington most wants to resolve, the automobile content requirements and the critical mineral supply architecture, are the issues that Greer's own analysis requires all 3 parties to address together. The bilateral play collapses when it confronts the supply chain reality that a bilateral deal cannot govern. Warren Buffett addressed the structural trap that the Clause 34 architecture represents through the framework he has used throughout this bilateral confrontation to identify the moment when the dominant party's strategy reverses its own logic. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have watched the same pattern produce unexpected outcomes in negotiation after negotiation. A powerful party designs a mechanism to protect its ability to exit an agreement it signed because it wants to maintain leverage over its partners. It builds the mechanism specifically to signal that permanence is conditional and that performance is required for continuation. And the mechanism does exactly what it was designed to do. It protects the ability to exit. What the powerful party fails to model is that the mechanism protects the ability to exit for everyone equally. Not just for the party with the most leverage, for all parties simultaneously. And when the less powerful parties in the agreement correctly read the mechanism and understand that it keeps the agreement in force regardless of whether the powerful party signals exit, their own behavior changes. They stop treating the exit threat as a sword over their head. They start treating the annual review as the operating condition of the relationship, which is exactly what it was designed to be. He paused. Trump designed the Article 34.7 sunset clause to give himself leverage over CUSMA's permanence. He used that leverage publicly, calling CUSMA irrelevant, floating bilateral deals, sending the message that his continued participation was conditional on satisfaction of his demands. What he did not model is that Carney read the same clause, talked to the same trade lawyers, understood that unless the United States formally withdraws, CUSMA stays in force for 10 more years, and concluded that the exit threat is not a sword over Canada's head, but a deadline that applies equally to all parties, including the one wielding it. The threat of exit is the threat to exit a framework that, once exited, costs 6 months of disruption during the notice period, congressional legislation to change domestic customs laws, the elimination of CUSMA exemptions that protect American manufacturers as much as Canadian exporters, and the certain political fury of the bipartisan congressional coalition, the agricultural sector, the automotive industry, and the American business community that has been uniformly and loudly telling Washington not to break the thing that is working. The specific legal constraints on the bilateral play extend beyond Article 34.7 into the CUSMA Implementation Act and the American Constitutional Framework for Trade Agreements in ways that Greer's public commentary has not directly engaged. Trade agreements of the complexity and scope of CUSMA are implemented in the United States through congressional legislation that creates domestic legal rights and obligations. The duty-free treatment for CUSMA-compliant goods is not granted by presidential proclamation. It is granted by the American customs laws that the CUSMA Implementation Act created. When a Canadian steel shipment crosses the border duty-free under CUSMA rules of origin, it is because the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, as amended by the Implementation Act, says it should be. The President cannot change the harmonized tariff schedule unilaterally. Only Congress can. And the bilateral deal that would replace CUSMA for Canada would require its own implementing legislation, its own domestic tariff law changes, and its own congressional process before it could create the legal rights it is supposed to provide. This is why the CSIS analysis published in January 2025 described the bilateral approach as creating a prolonged period of uncertainty that is far more costly for American industry than maintaining the trilateral. During the period between CUSMA's exit and a new bilateral agreement's implementation, which could be measured in years of negotiation, drafting, congressional debate, and ratification, the legal basis for CUSMA-compliant trade does not exist in an alternative form. The Canadian and Mexican exporters who were formerly exempt from American tariffs under CUSMA become subject to the 10% Section 122 surcharge, the 50% Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, and every other tariff instrument that CUSMA's exemptions were shielding them from. But simultaneously, the American manufacturers who depend on Canadian and Mexican inputs that were CUSMA exempt become subject to those same tariff costs on their inputs. The bilateral deal that is supposed to replace CUSMA cannot be placed in effect until Congress acts. And until Congress acts, both parties pay tariffs. The bilateral play is not a transition. It is a gap, and the gap has costs that fall on both sides of each border simultaneously. The congressional notification deadline that Greer faces on June 1st is the moment at which the legal architecture of Article 34.7 forces the administration's hand from rhetorical strategy into documented institutional commitment. By June 1st, Greer must tell Congress one of three things: that the administration intends to confirm extension of CUSMA for another 16 years, that the administration intends to signal non-renewal without withdrawal, activating the annual review mechanism, or that the administration intends to withdraw from the agreement, triggering the 6-month notice period and the domestic legal cascade that withdrawal requires. Each option has a specific institutional consequence that the previous 6 months of floating bilateral ideas and think tank speeches has not been required to engage with, because think tank speeches do not have to state a legally committed position. June 1st does. The notification that Greer sends to the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee on June 1st will be the first legally committed American position on CUSMA's future since the agreement entered into force. Every subsequent comment from every American official about bilateral deals, irrelevance, entry fees, and Canada's equivalence to China will be assessed against whatever Greer tells Congress in 19 days. And the assessment will happen in the context of a bipartisan congressional coalition that has been consistently and loudly pushing for renewal, a business community that testified for 3 days in December 2025 about the irreplaceable value of the integrated North American trade framework, and an agricultural sector that exports $176 billion annually to markets whose largest single component is Canada and Mexico. The $1.9 trillion figure is the number that the administration's bilateral rhetoric has not managed to make feel small. Trilateral trade in goods and services reached over $1.9 trillion in 2024. The CUSMA market covers 30% of global GDP. Canada alone is the top export destination for 36 American states. Canadian merchandise exports to the United States totaled nearly $550 billion in 2024, representing approximately 75% of total Canadian exports. The American agricultural sector's $176 billion in annual exports flows primarily to Canada and Mexico. American auto manufacturers' supply chains cross the Canadian and Mexican borders multiple times per vehicle. American steel consumers depend on Canadian steel for 22% of their supply at a time when domestic production cannot replace foreign supply on any timeline shorter than a decade. American nuclear utilities depend on Canadian uranium for 33% of their reactor fuel supply, a supply whose primary production facility just had its supply route severed by a bridge collapse in Saskatchewan 3 days ago. The integrated North American economy that CUSMA governs is not a trade relationship that can be decomposed into bilateral components without destroying the trilateral value that makes each bilateral component more productive than it would be alone. The auto part that crosses the border 8 times before becoming a vehicle does not cross it once as a Canadian-American transaction, and once as a Mexican-American transaction, and once as a Canadian-Mexican transaction. It crosses it 8 times as a North American transaction, governed by a framework that sets the rules for all 3 directions of trade simultaneously. A bilateral deal with Canada does not govern the Mexican content in the Canadian product. A bilateral deal with Mexico does not govern the Canadian steel in the American frame that the Mexican assembled car is built on. The trilateral architecture is the architecture that the supply chain requires, regardless of the political preference for bilateral control that the divide and manage strategy reflects. Canada's response to the bilateral play has been to hold the trilateral position while building the bilateral relationships with Mexico that make the trilateral requirement credible and the bilateral alternative impractical. The May 7th and 8th Mexico-Canada trade mission in Toronto and Montreal, which produced 1,800 business meetings in 48 hours, a joint ministerial statement, and a Business Council of Canada MOU witnessed by both ministers, confirmed by CBC News published yesterday, is the operational implementation of the trilateral defense strategy. LeBlanc and Mexico's Secretary of Economy Marcelo Ebrard, standing at the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations on May 8th, was not a diplomatic courtesy visit. It was the demonstration, on the day before the CUSMA review entered its final 49-day period, that the 2 partners Washington is trying to manage separately are meeting, coordinating, building bilateral commercial architecture, and issuing joint statements about their shared commitment to a trilateral outcome. The statement that the Mexicans are also committed to a trilateral deal is not an incidental diplomatic comment. It is the report from a government that has been having bilateral talks with Washington for months, and that has concluded, through those talks, that the trilateral framework serves Mexican interests better than any bilateral arrangement Washington is offering. Mexico has economic reasons for this conclusion that are independent of its relationship with Canada. Rules of origin for automobiles cannot be effectively governed by a bilateral U.S.-Mexico deal when 1/3 of the content in those automobiles comes from Canada. A bilateral U.S.-Mexico deal on rules of origin that does not account for Canadian content creates arbitrage opportunities that the supply chain will immediately exploit, producing a regulatory gap that serves nobody. The trilateral is the only legal architecture that can govern the integrated supply chain that 30 years of North American manufacturing development has built. The Jeffries assessment that the most likely outcome of the July 1st review is not clean renewal but prolonged limbo under annual reviews, with 75% probability, is the financial markets version of what the Clause 34 trap produces as a long-term operating condition. Annual reviews through 2036 is not a failure of the CUSMA framework. It is what Article 34.7 designed as the alternative to clean renewal or full withdrawal. The agreement stays in force. The tariff exemptions stay in place. The legal architecture of CUSMA-compliant trade continues, but the 6-year certainty horizon of a clean renewal becomes a 1-year certainty horizon of annual confirmations, and that shorter horizon makes it harder for businesses to justify the long-term investments that integrated North American supply chains require. A manufacturer who is deciding whether to build a new facility in Windsor that feeds a Detroit assembly plant needs to know that CUSMA will be in place for the duration of the facility's operational life. Annual review confirmation extends that certainty only 12 months at a time. The prolonged limbo that Jeffries is pricing at 75% probability is the political outcome of a negotiation that has not produced clean renewal, not the legal outcome of CUSMA expiration, because CUSMA does not expire in the absence of full withdrawal. The legal architecture survives, the commercial certainty does not, and the difference between legal survival and commercial certainty is measured in the investment decisions not made, the supply chain partnerships not formed, and the capital that flows toward environments where the legal framework is settled rather than reviewed annually. The RBC analysis of CUSMA's function in the bilateral trade war provides the specific number that makes the Clause 34 trap's consequence visible in market terms. A major reason the tariff war has caused less damage than some economists forecast is that much of the United States trade is protected under USMCA. That sentence, published in an April 2026 RBC analysis and confirmed by Policy magazine, is the accurate description of the function that CUSMA has been serving. The exemption that protects CUSMA-compliant Canadian goods from the 10% Section 122 surcharge, from the potential reapplication of Section 301 tariffs under the forced labor investigation, from the full stack of tariff instruments that Washington has assembled across 17 months of escalation, is the legal buffer that has kept the integrated North American supply chain functional at a level that has prevented the full force of the tariff war from landing simultaneously on both sides of the border. And that buffer is protected by Article 34.7. The annual review mechanism keeps it in place. The Implementation Act keeps it in domestic American law. The 6-month withdrawal requirement keeps the exit from being instantaneous. The bipartisan congressional coalition keeps the political cost of withdrawal above the threshold that any administration planning for November midterms wants to pay. Every layer of the architecture that Trump built, that Congress implemented, and that Carney is holding protects the buffer. And the buffer is protecting American manufacturers, American agricultural exporters, American automotive companies, and American consumers, as much as it is protecting Canadian exporters. The Clause 34 trap is not a trap only for Washington. It is a trap for the bilateral play specifically. The trap closes around the bilateral play because the bilateral play requires dismantling the legal architecture that keeps both sides protected. And neither side can afford to be unprotected simultaneously. So here's where we stand. Donald Trump called CUSMA irrelevant. He said we can have it or not. Greer floated bilateral deals to replace the Trilateral. Greer confirmed he had not held a single joint meeting with Canada and Mexico on CUSMA. The entry fee demands blocked the formal bilateral negotiating session. Canada and the United States have not started formal CUSMA talks. The formal review begins in 49 days. Greer must notify Congress in 19 days. And Article 34.7, the review and term extension provision that Trump's own trade team built into the agreement to create a periodic pressure mechanism, is the legal architecture that has stopped the bilateral play cold. Unless the United States formally withdraws with 6 months' notice, CUSMA stays in force for 10 more years. The Implementation Act that Congress passed makes the tariff exemptions domestic American law that no executive order can unilaterally remove. The bipartisan Senate coalition of Daines, Klobuchar, Boozman, and Warnock is pushing for renewal and has $176 billion in agricultural exports to point to. The U.S. auto industry testified for 3 days about CUSMA being irreplaceable. Mexico's Secretary Ebrard was in Montreal last week confirming trilateral commitment alongside Canada's LeBlanc. Canada and Mexico held 1,800 business meetings in 48 hours, building the bilateral commercial relationships that make the trilateral requirement credible. And Carney says it will take some time because Article 34.7 gives it time to take. Warren Buffett said the most dangerous trap in any negotiation is the one built by the person on your own side of the table. Trump built the sunset clause that he cannot now escape without paying the full exit cost. Can the Trump administration produce the bilateral deals it has been publicly discussing for 6 months when the legal architecture of Article 34.7 keeps the trilateral framework in force, regardless of whether formal talks have started? Can Greer's June 1st congressional notification credibly signal bilateral replacement of CUSMA when the bipartisan congressional coalition that must legislate any change to domestic customs law is on record opposing it? And the question that Article 34.7 poses to every trade lawyer, every supply chain manager, and every American exporter who has been listening to the bilateral narrative for 6 months. When the man who called the agreement irrelevant built the mechanism that keeps it in force, and the man who insisted on the mechanism is holding its terms, and the agreement covers $1.9 trillion in trade and 30% of global GDP, and protects American agricultural exports and automotive manufacturers and nuclear utilities from the full cost of their own supply chain exposure, what exactly is the argument that making it irrelevant is better than keeping it? Trump tried to shred the trilateral. Clause 34 stopped him cold. And the notification that Greer sends to Congress in 19 days will tell the world which of the 3 options the administration is choosing, with the knowledge that 2 of the 3 keep CUSMA in force, and the 3rd starts a process that takes 6 months, requires congressional legislation, and costs every American industry that the Business Roundtable, the Agricultural Lobby, the Automotive Manufacturers Association, and the bipartisan Senate coalition have spent 6 months explaining it cannot afford.